Well, it's great to have you all here this afternoon, and other people can just join us as they come along. So it's really nice to be in front of a New Zealand audience again. I have been in Australia for all of this year, working with other schools over here. I had to make a decision where I was going to be. So I'll be looking forward to being back in New Zealand sometime next year. So early in the year, hopefully. So for those who haven't met me before, my name is jtebbutt, and I started out as a parent of a child with a learning difficulty, and I was also a trained classroom teacher. And I just want to give a little bit of introduction about myself, and I will also be inviting you to put some things in the chat panel. And if you would like to add a questions and answers, if you'd like to put them up there when you think of them, any ones that are relevant to the section at the moment we'll deal with straight away, and other ones we actually might leave till the end. So it's really great to be here, and as I said, I started out as a primary trained teacher, and my career was going along quite nicely until we had our second child. And I realised quite quickly that he was different from our first. At first I thought, well, he's a boy and the other one was a girl, but there was a few things that alerted me to the fact that he was different. One of these was, I can remember waking up at 7 o'clock one morning and I found he was gone. And you can imagine, with being on a farm with rivers and troughs and all those sorts of things, how scary that was. But he was found 1.5 kilometres down the road. Luckily, he'd gone to visit his father at the cowshed. He had his little two-wheeler bike with trainer wheels, but really scary. And the other thing that he would like to do was, he was found on the apex of roofs. And fortunately, we weren't in sort of skyscraper territory, but the adults around him were very stressed. He wasn't. He went off to kindergarten, and within a few weeks, the kindergarten teacher said to me, your son's going to need a good wife. And I thought, what does that mean? And basically what it meant was that he went round from activity to activity, and he left a trail of destruction behind him, and somebody had to go round and tidy up after him. He had a few saving graces. One of them was that he was terribly cute. Everybody thought so. And he also had a sense of humour, which came out as a toddler, and he managed to get away with so much more than what he should have. And as we all know, our children go off to school, and at some point or other it actually stops being cute. And I can remember the class teacher said to me, he was an October baby, and by Christmas she was saying, a very experienced teacher, saying, your son's just not meeting his milestones. And I said, look, no matter, I'm a good primary trained teacher, prided myself at the time in my ability to teach reading and also to teach language. I used to write on my CVs that was a strength. And I said, look, I'll just get stuck in over the holidays and into term one, and I'm sure that it'll be fine. And I realised then that it wasn't fine. And I started to have some doubts about my own ability, thinking, how come I'm a trained teacher and I'm struggling to help my own child with his learning? So that set up a path for me of becoming a specialist teacher. I did a specialist teaching qualification with Spelled New Zealand, and we also got some assessments done with our son. And we were told very early on that he had dyslexia, and already people had started throwing around the term ADHD. Now, I didn't like the idea of ADHD. I have to admit I didn't know much about it in those days, but I certainly didn't like the idea of medicating my child. And in my wisdom, I thought, now, if you have a good structured program, we have a good homeschool partnership, we address all his learning needs, that all would be well in our world. And I have to say I was wrong. And I now recognise that all of the learning differences have social, emotional and behavioural components attached to them. And unless you address them all, we actually don't get the outcomes that we want. We ended up not diagnosing our son with ADHD until teenage years. And I now actually say we should be identifying that a lot earlier. So it was a very interesting journey into special education. I also got a specialist qualification from Massey, postgraduate qualification in literacy. And it was really both qualifications. My specialist teacher gave me the programs, the resources and the best practice. and the Massey gave me, sorry, the other way around, the programs, the resources, and the you know, the practical how-to, and Massey University gave me the research, the best practice, and also what's happening overseas. And I always say my son was my third qualification, and we have a bit of a joke in our house. He's 30 and he survived, and I've turned 60 this year, and this is my natural hair colour. So we actually sort of think that if you can survive grey hair and he survives, well, it's all good. But it has taken me on a very interesting journey, and it's actually led me to have some understandings in education that I actually really feel that we've made some mistakes in education and that we haven't really realised that we've made them. And I'm actually going to bring up the screen share now and share a PowerPoint with you, and I will be sending out this PowerPoint and also the notes that we're going to talk about today, so that you've got resources that you can use for future use. So if I just go into the slideshow from beginning, you should be able to see that now. And as I said, you will get this after the session, and tomorrow we will be sending out a recording. Okay, so as I mentioned, I believe that we've made a mistake in education. And I want you to think now about any class that you've ever taught in. And in those classes, we always have a few students who learn really easily. If we have some learning opportunities, we put some resources in front of them, they will just find learning easy. They hardly need a teacher, and we often call those students gifted and talented. There's not too many of those, but there are a few. The majority of our learners we call mainstream learners, and I call them second wave learners. And our second wave learners may be a bit above their chronological age. So they may even be 18 months or so above their chronological age, like your good B students. They may be students at chronological age, or they may be students who are below their chronological age, even 6 months to 18 months. But we do some great things in education. We've got some good literacy and numeracy programs on offer. We've got great specialist teachers like learning support coordinators, SENCOs, RTLB, RT-Lit, and we've also got some great teacher aides. And I've also put up here, it says up there the departments of education, but I've been working in Australia recently, and of course in New Zealand we have Ministry of Education, who's also supported us with good literacy and numeracy initiatives over the years. Now, it's not too difficult to bring our students who are 6 months to 2 years below our chronological age up to age or fairly close to it. And we've got some, because of those great programs that we've got. I'm going to miss third wave learners, and I'm going to come to our fourth wave learners for a moment. And fourth wave learners come under the umbrella of special education. Over the years, we've had different names for them, but traditionally, these are the students who've had major sensory difficulties like vision and hearing type problems, students with intellectual difficulties, students with physical difficulties that need support around the school for that, and also children with behaviour difficulties, severe behaviour group come into that. And often these are our OARS funded children. Now, we're actually told that that student group is no more than 3% of our student population. And we put a lot of resourcing and a lot of funding into that area, but it really only covers around 3%. Now, the group that's actually missing in the middle are our third wave learners. And our third wave learners are children who've had things like, or have things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, children on the autism spectrum, which includes Asperger's now. I count children with ADHD in there, not because ADHD is considered a learning difficulty, but what we now know is that many of the students with other learning difficulties also have ADHD. And some of the remediation that we want to put in for ADHD is actually similar to the others. And the other groups that I count in there are students with auditory and visual processing difficulties. Now, what we now know is that out of the learner groups in our classes, up to 22% of these children are actually third wave learners. And I believe that the mistake that we've made in education is that we have given these learners great low literacy programs or low numeracy programs, or we've tried to squash them into fourth wave learners without actually realising that they don't fit. And I've actually just written a book called The Wobbly Kids. And one of the things that I expect to be challenged about is, first of all, is the number of students. And I'd actually just like to invite you to put in the chat at the moment. So I said that this student number is 22%. Do you feel that the 22% is about right? There are more than 22%. Or that 22% is a bit exaggerated. And I'm just going to give you a moment to just put your thoughts in the chat there, and we'll just see what we can come up with. So you can just put it as a single word, or high, low, there we go, more, right, about right, well done, fair, that's about right, more than 22% at least. I haven't seen any there that is less than, and that is really interesting. Now, so I think that's great that that's something that we can all agree. Now, one of the reasons that I've come up with these numbers is, statistically, if we look at the number of people that are believed to have dyslexia around the world, the statistics agree on 11%. Although some people say it's more, there are 11% of people who have it significantly enough to impact their learning. The others have it mildly and can work around it. I've included 1% for children with dyspraxia. I have seen figures of a lot more, but I wanted to be conservative. I've seen figures on the autism spectrum, 3%, which includes the Asperger's. In New Zealand, we diagnose 2.5% of children with ADHD. And I don't think for 1 minute that we've got them all. Internationally, those figures are as high as 7%. And I think we're good at diagnosing the hyperactive, out there kind of child. But there are actually 3 types of ADHD: the inattentive type, the dreamy students who sort of fly under the radar, and also the mixed type. We now understand ADHD to be a chemical imbalance in the brain, and some days you're more hyperactive, other days that you're more inattentive. Now, we're all taught if a child can behave one day and not the next day, then it's a behaviour issue because they can behave when they want to. In the case of ADHD, that's not so. With the imbalance of chemicals, some days they find it much more difficult to be attentive, and on the brain, out the mouth continues to occur. So, but I've only counted 2.5% for ADHD. I've also counted 5% of children with auditory processing difficulties, and I haven't come up with a figure for visual processing, partly because I haven't seen a consensus on visual processing. I've seen good statistics on the number of children with learning difficulties that have visual processing problems, but not just as a whole. So if we leave visual processing out, the other groups come to 22.5%. And that's why I've taken that figure. And people tell me that there are, of course, and from our experience, we know that there are children who've got more than one diagnosis. So I figure even if we leave out the visual processing for children who have multiple diagnoses, you know, we're still being fairly generous there. Now, I said, which is a pretty bold statement, that I think that we've made a mistake in education. And the mistake that I believe we've made is that we haven't really realised that a third wave exists, and that we have tried to squash our children into low literacy numeracy programs, or we've tried to get special education funding. And I can say this for 2 reasons. We've got 2 pieces of evidence that show this. One of them is that I can line up the children who fit the third wave group from Bluff to Cape Reinga, and we've had children who've had good RTLB, they've had good RT-Lit, Syncos like me have had a go at them. They've had usually 2 or 3 literacy, numeracy support type programs, and they've had good teacher aides. And those students are still well below their chronological age, often up to 3 or 4 years or more, depending on how old they are. Now, the other reason that we know that there's a group of students whose needs that we're not really meeting is that if we look at our bell curve in education, New Zealand, along with other countries, is renowned for having a long tail of underachievers. And when we look, excuse me, at our long tail of underachievers, that number is actually about 25%. Excuse me. And 22% of children with learning difficulties, and perhaps 3% of children who are fourth wave learners. So we've got some evidence to say that that is the case. Now, a lot of people actually say to me then, well, what's the difference? How do you know whether a child is low literacy or whether they're third wave? And what we now know is that our third wave learners have underpinning cognitive weaknesses. And it's these underpinning cognitive weaknesses that prevent them from being able to access the curriculum. And I've actually grouped these into 6 key areas so that we can understand this easily. And so the difference between a low literacy student, they will be behind in their literacy, often 18 months to 2 years, but they don't have these underpinning cognitive weaknesses. Now, the first of these is visual processing problems. Now, what I'm about to give you is a really scary number. We actually now know that 70% of children with a learning who are third wave have some kind of visual problem. Now, often it's not visual, like they have perfect functional vision, but they have problems with visual processing in that the brain doesn't process the information that it sees. And so that can take the form of visual discrimination, where we've got a lot of our junior students who have their B's, P's, Q's and D's mixed up, and that can even go on into high school. M's and W's get mixed up, N's and U's get mixed up. We've also got words like was and saw, on and no. So they're not seeing the difference between words. And that's visual sequencing, the was and saw, that's also part of that visual. There's seeing things like back to front. And I often say, for example, in spelling, how often do you get children who spell the word help, H-E-P-L, they've got all the right letters, but they've got them in the wrong order. That's a visual sequencing problem. Then we've got other students who have difficulty with visual memory. They have trouble remembering what they've seen. We've got children who have visual figure ground difficulties. That is that they have trouble pulling out the important information from the background. So often in the classroom, there's all these things going on and they're not attending to the important thing. Students who have difficulty with comprehension, they can't go back to the text and find the information they want within the collection of other information. And the same when using posters and things like that, they can't screen out the background to pull out what they want. We have some students who have difficulty with visual closure. That is, they have trouble seeing the big picture. They can see parts of ideas when you're giving new teaching, new concepts, but they don't see the big picture. We've also got scanning and tracking, and we often talk about scanning and tracking type issues, and some of you may have heard about Erland's. So those are just some of the visual processing difficulties that students have, and it impacts many students. Now, I say I'm a specialist teacher, and I'd like to think I'm a good one, but if you give me a child who's got an undiagnosed visual weakness or visual problem, or an unremediated one, none of us as teachers can do our best work. And what I have found in my journey is that unless we address the underpinning weaknesses, we don't get the outcomes that we want. So it's important to address vision. Now, auditory is very similar. Many of our students have auditory weaknesses. They have difficulty hearing the difference between letter sounds, and so that goes right up even into higher levels of primary, intermediate. And if I give a stage 1 phonological assessment to year 9 students, I often have students who've got big gaps. some students who have auditory memory difficulties. They don't take information in well and retain it auditorily. We have children with auditory sequencing difficulties. So those students have trouble learning processes and following the steps in a process, retelling events, recounting events, and so on. Again, we've got the auditory figure ground where they can't screen out the auditory background. And again, auditory closure. So if we're presenting new concepts in an auditory format, some children don't take that in well. We actually know that 99% of our students have got a phonological weakness. And some schools now, thankfully, are embarking on the structured literacy, phonemic, phonological approach, because we now know that I've seen the figures of 99% of children with a learning difficulty have phonemic and phonological weakness. And if you look at the international research, which covers Britain, America, New Zealand and Australia, all concur that phonemic and phonological teaching has to be the main thrust of our reading and literacy programs. David Kilpatrick, who's one of the specialists, the world-renowned greats in America, is actually saying that 40% of our students are not learning and achieving well, given our current literacy approaches. And so to bring those figures down, and he suggests we can bring them down to as low as around 8%, that we have to embark on this as our primary approach to reading, particularly in the junior years. The next one is short-term and working memory. And they actually say for everybody to be a good learner, they have to have good short-term and working memory. And when we assess these students, poor short-term and working memory. The next one is gross and fine motor skills. Now, a number of people have said to me, well, Jenny, why do we worry about gross and fine motor skills? We don't all have to be good sports people. Now, that's true. We don't all have to be good sports people. But what we now know is that if you have poor gross and fine motor skills, you've got poor left-right brain integration. And if you've got poor left-right brain integration, then you're at risk for learning difficulties. So we are interested in gross and fine motor skills. And the last one is processing delays. And how often do we have students in classes who actually take far longer to complete tasks than others? Some students, you ask questions, they need a lot more thinking time. And we now recognise processing delays as part of the underpinnings. So just to recap then, the difference between a low literacy student and a third wave student, our third wave students will have, I would say, 2 or more of these underpinning weaknesses, and many students have multiple underpinning weaknesses. Now, I often talk about with our waves, and if we just go back to the waves, it is possible to be a first wave learner and a third wave learner at the same time. We can actually have students who are gifted and talented and also have a learning difficulty, and their third waveness actually pulls down their scores. We actually now know that 10 to 15% of our learners in schools will be in this category. And I believe that one of our jobs is how can we identify the students who are first wave and also third wave. Now, it is also possible that you might have a student who has a visual problem, but no other underpinnings. And if we determine that they have a visual problem and we address that problem, then they can go on to achieve their potential. But by and large, the students who are third wave learners actually have multiple third wave characteristics. And so our next job then actually has to be, how do we assess our students so we can determine whether they're low literacy or whether they're third wave learners. Now, again, I'm actually just going to get you to put this in the chat. When we're talking about learning waves and we're talking about underpinning cognitive weaknesses, is this resonating with you? Has what we've talked about so far, is that making sense for you in terms of your experience in the classroom? So just a simple yes or no will be fine here. Fantastic. And I find this really interesting that this is the case, because we were all trained in mainstream programs. We were all taught that if a child has a reading, writing, spelling or maths problem, we should give them a reading, writing, spelling or maths solution. It might be with a different person, it might be with a different program, but it still focuses on the academic area. What we are doing is we are looking at doing assessments that determine these underpinning cognitive weaknesses. Because when we can determine these underpinning cognitive weaknesses and address these alongside the curriculum and the academic programs, then we're starting to get change with the students who have continually underachieved. And I might say at this point too, I've had many students who've actually said to me, year 7, 8, 9 upwards, you can't help me, miss, everybody has tried, I'm done. And I feel that there's students that we, in the third wave, that we owe an apology to, because I don't see these students have failed the system. The system has actually failed them. And if we can actually teach our students in the right way, they will be able to achieve to their potential, and they will be able to learn. So I want to actually talk about now then, what is the key things that are important for that? So if we've got to make a difference with the students that we're talking about in the third wave, what is it exactly that we've got to do? And I've come up with 7 excellences of teaching that I would like to share with you today. And no doubt you will feel that you have are doing well in some of these areas, but there are other areas that you'll feel that you can develop further. Now, the first of these is multisensory. Now, I do recall that when learning styles first came out, we all rushed out to find out whether we had visual, auditory or kinesthetic was our favoured learning modality. We actually now know that that's not how it works. What the research is saying is that everybody learns best when they have an opportunity to learn it through all the senses. So when you can hear it, see it and do it, you uptake the learning more optimally. So multisensory teaching is the key. Now, if we look at our third wave learners, and I mentioned that they can have auditory or visual weaknesses, and in fact, many of our children have both. Now, this multisensory teaching is even more important for third wave, because if you've got an auditory weakness and you're predominantly in an auditory learning environment, you're at risk. Now, one of the things that we've been told about our education system is it has been a predominantly auditory learning place. If you're a good auditory learner, you tend to do well, and if you're not, you do less well. Now, I know that there are pockets of excellence, and I would also like to think that we are making change in that area, but you can still walk into a number of classrooms and you'd have to say that auditory was the favoured modality. And I actually think that part of that is because that's the environment that we grew up in education. And you know how they often say with parents that you often parent how your parents did unless you systematically go about changing that. I actually think that's true about teaching, that unless we go about changing it, we actually teach the way that we were taught, and it's just inherent in us. So that's the auditory. Now, it's the same for visual. If you've got children with visual weaknesses and they're predominantly in a visual learning environment, they're at risk. So the only way that this can work is if every classroom in every country in the world actually focuses on multisensory teaching, then we're going to get the best outcomes. And I actually now recommend that teachers, if they're planning a unit, planning a lesson, that they actually have a line in there that says multisensory and what they're actually covering for each, to make sure that it's multisensory teaching. Now, the next one of these is actually structure. And I think we probably all agree that schools are pretty structured places. You know, we've got subject areas, we've got bell goes at certain times, we've got morning tea, we've got lunch. The periods are X amount of time. We give a certain amount of each day to certain areas of the curriculum. We have assemblies and so on. But it's interesting because there are days where school is less structured. If you think about sports days, if you think about visiting speakers, And usually on those days, there are a group of students who struggle. And if you think about days where you've actually had relievers in, like you've been away, or that their teacher aides have been away, often those students end up in trouble on those days. And when we actually look at who those students are, they're actually our third wave learners. And the reason for that is our third wave learners have trouble organising themselves. They have trouble putting structure in for themselves when their environment isn't as they would expect. And they rely on their parents, their teachers, and their teacher aides to provide the structure that they can't. And if for some reason that one of those things or more isn't available to them, they break down. So our third wave learners require much more structure, and we actually have to teach strategies for them to build their own structure and also to manage when the structure is not in place. The next one is sequential. Now, I liken this to dot. You know how in a colouring book you've got 30 dots and you go from 1 to 30, and if you get from 1 to 30, you can actually see the big picture. Well, our first and second wave learners don't need to go from dot to dot. They can go to a sports day, they can go on a family holiday, they can be off school for whatever reason, and provided they don't get too many gaps, they can get to the end of school, NCEA, level 1 and 2, and perform quite nicely. Our third wave learners absolutely cannot. They have to go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and sequentially up to 30. Otherwise, they end up with such huge gaps in their learning that they end up going to secondary school with reading ages of 9, 10, 11. Sometimes they're stage 3, 4 in the numeracy curriculum, and they have writing levels as low as 2. And so for those students, they actually need much more focus on the developmental stages of learning. And we actually haven't trained our teachers like that. Over the last few years, there has been more that has come into play, things like the literacy learning progressions, the English second language progressions, even the numeracy project coming in and talking about the stages and the concepts that students have to learn at each stage. So we have in some areas, but it requires that teachers are very knowledgeable about the developmental stages of learning. We have to know exactly where a child is at and move them on to the next steps. And even at primary level, we weren't trained that well. Our poor secondary counterparts, we train our secondary teachers in subject areas. And when you talk to most secondary teachers, and I'm sure that there are some on here today, it wouldn't be unreasonable for you when you first started teaching to expect that most of the children, or that the children who came into secondary school could actually read and write well enough to access the curriculum. And now we're actually finding that students are not in a position to read and write well enough to access the curriculum, and we haven't trained our secondary teachers in developmental stages of learning. Now, fortunately, many secondary schools have recognised this, and they have actually taken on some primary trained staff, or maybe the SENCO or specialist teacher has got that knowledge. But by and large, we're still sending children around from teacher to subject area without having that developmental focus in their curriculum subjects. So that's a challenge. And I have actually seen many students who, if you assess them at year 9, they can wander around school for 2 or 3 years, however long it is till they leave, and they actually don't have achievement gains. And this actually happens because they haven't, if you put a student who's at stage 2 or 3 in a year 9 classroom, which is operating at stage 5 or 6 of the curriculum, that student has got nothing to pin their knowledge on, and they can't access it. So they're not able to build on their knowledge. So those are some of the things that we actually need to look at in that area. This one is actually around research-based, evidence-based practice, and we now know so much more about the brain than what we used to. And there is some very interesting research that is able to support us in education. For example, we now know that the amygdala, the emotional centres of the brain, are far more important in learning than what we thought. And if we don't address students' emotional needs, they're not in a position to learn. We also know that executive functioning is important. Good decision-making skills, seeing the consequences of your actions, being able to plan decisions and plan steps in a process moving forward. And we actually have found that our third wave learners don't pick up executive functioning skills in the same way that first and second wave do. And that unless we explicitly teach executive functioning skills, we end up with a group of students who are poor in that area. And the research is actually showing very negative social consequences for students who don't have good executive functioning skills. I could actually run a whole seminar on that, but I think for today, it's really just about understanding that executive functioning is important. We've also talked about learning styles and how multisensory teaching is important. So all those things come into the brain compatible, the research-based, and we're looking at evidence-based teaching. So we're looking at best practice. And actually, one of the points I want to make here about the best practice is something else that's really interesting. I don't believe we have as much research in third wave best practice as we do in second. And we often get quoted best practice as if we do. So what I'm saying here is that best practice for first and second wave will not necessarily be best practice for third wave. And I'm going to give you an example of that. This example is around modern and innovative learning environments. Now, there's been research into innovative learning environments suggesting it's good for us to move to that. But if you've got a student who's got poor visual and auditory underpinning weakness, and we put them in a classroom where there are 3 or 4 classes, all we are doing is multiplying the visual and the auditory difficulties that that student will have when they're in a single cell classroom. Now, there are things that we can do to minimise the effects of it, but our setup for our innovative learning environments have often revolved around the building, not around training and using them. And I've got teachers all around the country who say that they're third wave learners, and parents actually, who say that their learners are absolutely struggling in innovative learning spaces. And that's a really good example of where what's considered best for mainstream is not necessarily best for third wave. And so we need to start looking at the research and saying, who is this research for? And what I say, just as we have to differentiate our teaching, and the ministry has some great initiatives around that, and looking at us differentiate our teaching, we also have to differentiate our learning spaces so that we can optimise the environment for our different learners. So brain compatible, research-based, evidence-based, really important. The next one is repetition and overlearning. Now, with repetition and overlearning, they actually say if the average child takes 7 times to learn something, then children with learning difficulties, it can be up to 49 times. For children who are fourth wave, it's up to 64 times. And again, I'd like to think I'm a good teacher, and I would actually say even the best teachers are actually going to struggle to put the amount of repetition and overlearning that our third and fourth wave learners require in a mainstream classroom setting. Yes, sure, we have strategies that we use, but how do we really cater for our gifted and talented while we're working with our third and fourth wave? And what do we do with our third and fourth wave while we're extending our first wave? Now, to combat this, what I actually recommend is that we have a school-wide system. And I work with learning support coordinators, CENCOs, RTLB, and we look at setting up a team system within a school. And if children are lucky, the ones that we've identified may get 1 or 2 sessions a week with a specialist teacher. Not more than that, because we can't afford it. Then we train our class teachers, and we really give them training in best practice teaching, and meeting the needs of all learner waves, not just our third wave or not just our first and second wave. And class teachers do 7 times best practice. Then we train all our teacher aides, and we train them in third wave programs, and we get them working with identified students, and they are trained in supporting the underpinning weaknesses along with the literacy and the numeracy academic area. Then I also work a lot with parents, and I actually, I'm just running parent courses in both New Zealand and Australia now, but last year I ran a parent course every month, and any school in New Zealand could invite their parents to join this course free. And I'm now going to be running 2 sessions. The first is going to be an introduction to learning difficulties, and the second, the next month, is going to be supporting your child with reading, spelling, literacy, and we may even go to numeracy as well. But so really a support program. And when we train our parents to do targeted support for third wave, and we get them doing 3 sessions a week, they also are helping to provide the repetition and overlearning. Now, we've also trained community volunteers because some parents work night shift, and we all know the kind of challenges that a lot of families are under at the moment. And there are people in church groups, people in Lions, Rotary, Friends of the Library, Grey Power, who, if you ask them, they will come along and do training, and they will come into school and they will support with repetition and overlearning. And then finally, we also use software programs, really good software programs like STEPS, Learning Staircase, Learning Literacy Web. We use Betsy Sewell's Word Chain. We use Maths Buddy, Mathletics. I've been working with Literacy Planet here in Australia, and they're also in New Zealand. And we provide really good software 3 or 4 times a week. And between all of us, specialist teacher, class teacher, teacher aides, parents and community, and software, we can then come somewhere close to the amount of repetition and overlearning that we need. And it's really difficult for any class teacher to set that up on their own, but if we have a school-wide approach, then we can do it. And without that school-wide approach and the repetition and overlearning, our third wave learners won't get the amount that they need. The next one is it must be based on diagnostic evidence. And we're pretty good now at doing ASTL, good doing PATs and identifying the academic area and the year level attainment that our students are at. But now we need to go have the underpinning cognitive weaknesses alongside that. And the interesting thing is all the assessment that we've been doing tells you the what, like where a student is at and like what their achievement levels are. When we do the underpinning cognitive weaknesses, it tells us the why. And when we know the why, we can then put in the steps to make a difference. But knowing the what on its own isn't enough. And the last one, the 7th one, is actually metacognitive strategies. Now, we actually know that our third wave learners don't pick up metacognitive strategies in the same way as our first and second wave learners. We've all been in classes where our first wave learners, someone will put their hand up and say, I've got a better way than you, miss. This is the way that I do it. And they sure have got a better way than you. They actually know how to find strategies. But our third wave learners, if they don't get explicit metacognitive strategy teaching and then the 49 times to practice it, they actually don't pick them up. And I'm going to make an admission here. I am 99% sure that I am an unidentified student with ADHD who went through school. And I was one of those dreamy children that were never picked up. I actually failed school beautifully. I failed school C. I actually left school and I came back a couple of years later and got university entrance and went to Teachers College. I spent my whole of Teachers College thinking I was going to fail. I was at best a C+ student and I worked hard. I was one of those really hard workers. It actually took me till I was 40 to find out that A, I had ADHD, and B, that I didn't pick up metacognitive strategy teaching in school. And I was in a university class actually, and it was on sociology. And I remember joking that I didn't even know what sociology was. And the first unit was on learning to learn. And the lecturer that was up there talked about all these good learning strategies that students have. And I realised, to my horror, that I was 40 years of age. I was actually a Senko, and if that lady up the front was right, I didn't know a lot about learning. And I actually decided to prove that she was wrong. We had a test, and of course we also had a final exam, and I chose to leave everything I knew about learning, and I didn't learn anything off by heart. I didn't read things 100 times. I didn't study late at night, and I certainly didn't get up the morning of the test and study. I did use mind maps. I did use highlighters. I did think about what the content was and how it related to my life. And these were all the strategies that she said that good learners use. Anyway, there was 200 people in this, it was a summer school program in the lecture theatre. And when the exam results came out, I actually got first out of 200 people. And then I realised that she was actually right. I was 40 and didn't know much about teaching, but I certainly learned. And I actually believe now that these are some of the experiences that I've had that lead me to understand our third wave learners. And we don't want people to have to wait till they're 40 to find that out. We actually want to help children discover this in primary school or as early as possible and support them to find their strengths. So I became an A student, and I've been an A student ever since. But before that, it was absolutely elusive to me. And when I look at these strategies, this is why I believe in excellence in teaching looks like this for our third wave learners. So those are the 7 excellences. Now, what I want to do is I want to spend a bit of time looking at the characteristics of children who fit into that third wave. When I work with schools, and I work with LSC and Senko's teachers, teacher aides, all the schools that I work with tell me that they would be lucky if 3 to 5% of their students actually have a diagnosis. And that means that we have a lot of children floating around in school who don't have a diagnosis. We perhaps have got some idea what their difficulties are, but we don't have a diagnosis, and we don't have an understanding of their underpinning cognitive weaknesses. And they've been students who have gone through school this far and are highly underachieving. So one of the reasons I like this characteristic list, it was actually given to me when my son was first diagnosed with learning difficulties, and I liked it because it had layman's language. You can give this to parents and they get it. You can give this to teachers who don't have any training in specific learning difficulties, and they get it. And I'm going to send you out this as a checklist as well, and I recommend that teachers put like a student's name at the top, and they go through and they tick off how many characteristics they have. What I think you'll be surprised about with this list is very often we think these are personality characteristics rather than characteristics of learning difficulties. So we kind of miss students because of that. So how many children in your class are, you think of them as intelligent, but then they don't always perform to the intelligence level that you think they've got? You see a bit of a mismatch. They're good in some things and not in others. That's unusual. They should perform to their intelligence level. So that's one sign. Now, I should also say at this point, you're looking for a cluster. You're not looking just for 1 or 2 things. Now, when I first read this, I think there was only 20 or 22 characteristics of learning difficulties. And we were told that if a child should have 6 or more. I've revamped this, and we've now got, I think, 32 characteristics. And I usually start at 10. And I think you'll start having some aha moments and thinking about students that you've worked with, and certainly they'll have many of these. So also it's a child who has selective hearing. They also hear some things but not others. And often I have people then say, isn't that all children? Well, yes, I do understand that some children seem to have selective hearing, especially if they're watching TV or they don't want to hear something. But what we say is that our children do it longer, louder, and more often. So if you've got a student in your class who actually stands out with their selective hearing because they do it more often than others, and they're more pronounced than others, then that's a characteristic. The child who never has what they need at the right time and they forget everything. Now, we can now link this back to the short-term and working memory difficulties. Our children are in trouble at home and they're in trouble at school. They've never got their sun hat. They've forgotten their swimming togs. They forgot the note that they needed. The lunch money or the trip money is still on the table at home. When they get home, they didn't get their reading book, and so it goes on. Now, these children don't want to do this because they don't want to be in trouble and they don't like missing out on playing on the field at lunchtime or going swimming. So it's not a choice, it's part of the learning difficulty. And secondary school students are still the same. How many of your children turn up to class and they haven't got the right books and they haven't got the right gear? So annoying, and you think at that age that they should have had it sorted. The child whose room and desk are always in a mess and they always have a dishevelled appearance. Now, in the old days where we had desks, this was actually quite pronounced, but now we tend to have, if you're lucky, you still have lockers, but often they have just places in the room where things are kept. So it's not so easy to see. But you can often see this on a student's person. How many kids come to school and they hardly look like they've brushed their hair? They have their jerseys on back to front. They get grubby really quickly, grubby knees and so on. So those students often stand out. The clumsy children who trip over their own feet. And we would just say, oh, there's a clumsy child. But if you've got visual processing, visual problem, or you've got gross or fine motor skill problem, that makes you clumsy. The child who doesn't pick up the rules of socialising. And there is actually always a socialising component with this. We have students who have difficulty making friends with their own age or keeping friends their own age. They'll often be better with children who are younger than them or older than them, but not the same age. They're often good with babies, but again, not the same age. And they actually don't pick up the social norms. So these kids are often in trouble because they've done something, and they'll actually come to you and they'll say, I got into trouble, I don't even know what I did. You know, or I didn't do anything. And so whenever a child says that to me, I think, oh, I've got to, what is it that I need to teach this child that they don't already know? We've already talked about children who get the sequence of letters wrong and that you get confused by the order of numbers. We now know that's a visual processing problem. The children who can't keep their hands to themselves and are always touching others, we would have thought of that as a behaviour problem, but it's actually linked to the social skill problem. They actually haven't picked up norms. Children who carry on a joke long after it's finished. You know, you're in the class, we have a joke, it was funny, but someone actually has to carry it on. Now, there's always a component of the language of time with this. The children who get confused between breakfast, lunch and dinner, they mix up words like yesterday, today, tomorrow when they're speaking. They really get confused between the one before and the one after in maths. They have trouble telling the time. And when we do their interviews, you ask them for their birth date, they have trouble knowing their birth date. Even older students will not know their birth date. The students who get frustrated when they make mistakes, they can go from 0 to 100 in terms of anger when something upsets them in a split second. And I'm sure you have students who actually have meltdowns. And I have parents and teachers who say to me, he just lost it and it was over nothing. Now, when I get to speak to these students, it wasn't over nothing. There was usually lots of things that actually happened, but what we saw was the straw that broke the camel's back. But this is, the meltdowns are a characteristic. They're often afraid to try new things and they're frightened by change in routines. So if you change the timetable on them and they're not expecting it and they don't feel prepared, they can often have a bit of a meltdown. So they like to know exactly where they are, what's happening and what's expected of them. And I've even seen lots of adults who actually have learning difficulties that are still, they don't like being thrown in the deep end. They'd rather be thought of as naughty than thought of as stupid. So it's a bit cool to be naughty, but it's not cool to be stupid. So they'll behave badly so that people see them as naughty rather than see them as not as intelligent. This is the child who has difficulty with comprehension. They can't picture things in their mind and they can't remember what they see. And again, that's part of the visual processing. We've talked about the children who sit quietly but don't learn. They often have poor sense awareness, and they like the jerseys in summer and the t-shirts in winter. They hug the cat too tightly. They can really grip pencil too hard and they get sore hands when they're writing because they're putting too much pressure on. We've got a few of those in every class. They can often be covered in bruises, and when you say, gosh, you've got a bad bruise, how'd you get that? They've got no idea. So it's that sense awareness, and their regulator is off. This is a child whose language often comes out as jumbled. They can often stop and start in the middle of sentences, and you can hear it on certain words. They'll say things like hopsitals, aminals, and eminies. And if you look at that, they've got all the right syllables, but they're in the wrong order. So this is an auditory sequencing and a visual sequencing difficulty in writing. And there are certain words that they can't say, and that's and there's actually often a sort of a lisp. Sometimes it's very subtle, but there is a speech component to this. They're often a good strategist, but then they don't get a riddle or a joke. So they understand complex things, but then don't understand abstract things or sometimes easy things. We often have children who yawn during learning. There are some children, every time they pick up a book, they yawn. It's actually a sign of a visual processing problem. And I think we've all been through, including me, oh, you look tired. What time did you go to bed? It's got nothing to do with that. It's part of the learning difficulty. They also have unexpected difficulties with some motor skills. So they might be good at playing soccer, but then they trip over their own feet. That's odd. They should either be good with their feet or not. It shouldn't be in certain situations. And that leads on to the next one, performance inconsistency. Our children have days where they can do things and days where they can't. You can teach them something one day, they appear to have got it. You go to visit it again the next week and it's gone. This happens to them all the time in tests and exams. They do their homework, they learn for their test or their exam, and come the morning of the test or exam, the information's gone and it comes back the next night when they're watching TV. They don't need it anymore and it's too late. And we think this is frustrating for us as teachers. It's even more frustrating for the student. And this actually leads to a lot of people who don't have a lot of training around learning difficulties. You'll often hear them say that they can do things when they want to. That's actually not true. Some days these kids wake up and their neurons don't fire, and other days they wake up and things are working really well. So, and it's part of the profile. They're often very particular and they want things done a certain way. These are often the children who are on the spectrum. And in fact, some of these children, they're very pedantic about the way that they keep their room. Everything has to be in a nice box and straightened up. Their clothes have to be just right. Their belongings at school have to be just right. And if people touch their stuff and mess it up, they can have meltdowns. But it's usually spectrum children that fit this one. They will often tell tales on others, which gets them into trouble. And our kids are very good at, telling tales. I've realised that's come to do with their self-esteem, and they would rather, they want to point out that other people make mistakes so that they don't feel like they're the only one. But of course, it doesn't win friends and it doesn't influence people. And sometimes they can be bossy, other times they can be a bully, and then they can even be the one who's bullied. They often have these role changes, and I often have RTLB who do observations, and they will often actually say that the third wave learners don't usually start the problem, but when the problem happens, they don't know how to handle it and they behave badly and it looks like they're the problem, which is actually quite interesting. So our children need a lot of explicit teaching around social skills. They often play well with children younger or older than themselves. We've talked about that. They can often skip or add words when reading aloud or missing lines, and we now recognise that as a scanning and tracking problem, and we probably did before actually. That was quite a common one that we knew. They often see things as black and white. They don't get inference or innuendo. If you tell a student, pull your socks up, behave yourself, they will look down and say, I'm not wearing any. Now, I know that those old-fashioned sayings often children don't get, but these kids, you have to say exactly what you mean because they don't get inference. They're often thought of as lazy because they're quick to do things that they like, but slow when it involves work. And that actually has to do with the neurons firing. When they're interested, things work better up there. When they're not interested in a topic, nothing works, even if they want them to. The child has confusing or unexpected difficulties. Maybe they can add or multiply, but then they can't subtract or divide. Sometimes these children can't do maths in their head, but they can do it on paper. And the reason for that is that when they use paper, they don't have their short-term and working memory difficulties are taken away because they've got paper. But these children can't hold the numbers in their head and actually manipulate them. They'll often make social mistakes. They smile at everybody. They greet strangers with open arms. They have a good nature and they're the butt of jokes. And often they won't even realise that people are playing jokes on them or that they're being made fun of. Again, that's the social things. These students can often say things off topic, either at mat time or in class discussion time for older students. And this is interesting because they often, if you have time to follow where their thinking is, and you say to them, what made you think of that in relation to what we were talking about? They're usually 10 steps ahead of us and they've seen some obscure link between what we're talking about and what's in their head. But it appears that they're off topic. Sometimes they understand complex things, but then they have trouble doing things that other people find easy. And again, that's odd. And very occasionally they'll have a big chip on their shoulder. Fortunately, not too often, because I find that's a really hard thing to change because it's to do with their self-esteem. So they'll say, I've got ADHD, I've got dyslexia, I can't do that, I can't do this. But there's not too many. Now, the challenge with all this is you can line up 20 children who are third wave and they will all have different characteristics. There isn't a recipe. There isn't like a standard procedure or a process that you can use for these students. So, yeah, you'll see you're looking for between 6 and 10 or more characteristics of students. And again, I'm actually going to invite you to make a comment in the chat box. As we were going through these, did you think of students in your classes that you know haven't been diagnosed that fit a number of these characteristics? So did it resonate with you? Just put yes or no regarding the characteristics, and that will be good to see. Let's see how we're going on with these. Again, so far, resounding yeses. Yes, absolutely. And this is interesting because only 3 to 5% of our children are diagnosed. And so this would be the first step. We would do this checklist, and any student that we have 6 to 10 or more, we would want to be investigating further. And it's really interesting. Somebody actually says, yes, even myself. And I think, to be honest, we would all have some characteristics of learning difficulties. I've got a couple, but I'm lucky. I didn't have the dyslexia to go with my ADHD. And I often, the couple that I've got are more sort of time related and things like that. But we actually now know that 50% of our children with dyslexia also have ADHD. And I think that's a little known fact in education. And I think that we often tend to diagnose one thing. And if you don't diagnose the other things, those things go on to trip people up. And I found that in my son's case, I really wish that we diagnosed the ADHD earlier. And I have actually also noticed in his adult years that a lot of it's around social difficulties, and it's actually on the spectrum kind of things, which is interesting because that was never diagnosed. But so many of these are sort of interlinked. And what I have found is that if we don't find the range of difficulties, we don't get the outcomes. Now, I just want to round this off this afternoon. If we're looking at specialist assessments, so once we've got students with specialist assessments, like we find students with 6 to 10 or more characteristics, we would want to look at specialist assessments, particularly where you've got students who have been offered 3 or 4 more low literacy, they've had RTLB, they've had RT-Lit. The great thing about specialist assessments is that they show us a student's strengths and weaknesses, and then we can design a specific support program. When we know a student's strengths, we can use their strengths to help them. And the other thing is we can actually change our thinking. I talk to students, these are your strengths, you are very skilled in these areas and you're going to do well in this, this and this, and you should be proud of your achievements. I also understand that you find some things difficult and these are the things you find difficult. Now we're going to support you with these, but we're going to focus on your strengths. And what happens when you do that is students' self-esteem turns round. I believe that many of our third wave learners, their self-esteem is based on what they can't do, not what they can do. And they've already decided they're a bad learner and they must be silly because they can't read and write well and so on. So that changes things for them. It was also necessary for readers and writers, and we have moved on in that we can now get assessments done at school for readers and writers, and that's fantastic. Assessments are expensive, but I would still prefer to have a specialist assessment rather than the school-based assessment. The school-based assessment focuses on the academics. The assessments that we do and the specialist assessments focus on the underpinning cognitive weaknesses. And we can improve a student's performance so much by having that information. So if there isn't funds, then we want the school reader-writer for exams to go forward. But there are a number of ways that we can look for funds and we can find funds, and I'm happy to talk to schools about that. Again, we can have another whole seminar on this. Now, the other thing that we're looking for is we're looking for the auditory and visual problems. If a student has visual processing problems, we want to send them to a behavioural optometrist. And there is also an app that you can use that provides 4 visual tests and 4 auditory tests, which can confirm your thinking. Now, I'm going to give you this link to this app in the notes that I send, because I actually recommend, in fact, I recommend you download it and do the tests on yourself and watch yourself fail. I failed nicely and didn't even know that I had a visual processing difficulty, but I discovered it through this. And so if we suspect that a student has a visual or an auditory problem, we can put them through this to confirm it before referring to a behavioural optometrist. Now, the reason you want to go to a behavioural optometrist, a normal optometrist looks at functional vision and eye health and some aspects of near-far, like being able to see the whiteboard and so on. But a behavioural optometrist looks at how the eyes behave when they're learning, and they look at visual processing. So they can also do the other things that the optometrist does, but our students, any student who's got a vision and learning problem needs to see a behavioural optometrist rather than an auditory optometrist. Now, with auditory, there are 2 types of students. Now, I don't rush to refer to auditory processing because I find lots of students have an auditory weakness, and when we know how, we can teach the auditory weakness and improve it. But some children have full-blown APD, the auditory processing disorder, and do need to see an audiologist. But I will usually trial the teaching of auditory underpinning first, because if a parent has to go to a specialist assessment, a behavioural optometrist, and we say auditory as well, it gets very expensive. And the other place you may need to refer to, if you're suspecting that a child has dyspraxia, ADHD, or is on the spectrum, you'll be wanting to refer to either a paediatrician or to ICANS, that they assess the infant, child, adolescent mental health service. They assess ADHD. They've got different names around the country. So each area will have its own kind of referral process, and I can help you navigate that if you aren't able to already. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I would like to look at, just summarise what we've covered and also recommend some next steps. So the first thing that we talked about was we talked about understanding those learning waves. Now I'm actually going to send you out a classroom learning waves recording sheet, and I actually recommend you wave your class. Who in my class is first wave? Who do I think is second wave? Who do I think is third wave? And who do I think is fourth wave? Now that finds the beginning of then appropriately teaching for those students. So the next thing is, after you've waved your students, we've talked about understanding underpinning cognitive weaknesses. Now, with the cognitive weaknesses, we want to then look at, do we need to look at next steps? Now, I actually train schools in screening assessments for underpinning weaknesses. And I actually believe each school needs to have some people on their staff who can do this work. When we look, if we've got 22% of students, you don't want to refer out all the time for doing that. And unless we identify who's second wave low literacy and who's third wave, then that's a challenge. So I'm happy to talk with schools if they want to talk some more about that. We also then went on to talk about the knowledge of the 7 excellences. And I think the question that you'll be asking yourself here is, which of these do I do well, and which are my next areas of development? So which of the 7 do I want to develop? And then I recommend that you use the 32 characteristics tool with students that you are concerned about who haven't yet been identified. Now, from today, some of you will feel I've got a lot to keep going with. You'll have the slide notes, you'll have the 32 characteristics list, you'll have the ICEPT vision and auditory test, and you'll also have the way putting your students into learning waves. And some of you, that will be fine. And I really encourage you to take those recommended actions. For those of you that want more, the Wobbly Kids, my new book, the handbook, is out for schools, and that would be a good tool to use. I've also got a 4-session webinar series which will be offered to take today's session further, and this is actually going to include the teaching and resource for undertaking screening assessments. And there are also whole school development opportunities available for those who would actually like to go on a whole school journey. My email address is on here, and also my websites in both Australia and New Zealand. And at this point, I'm actually going to stop the share, and we're going to go to question and answer time. And I can see that there's a couple of questions in the chat area, and so we can perhaps take those first, and if you've got any other questions, we can have those now. So Madeline, would you like to read those ones?
Okay, yes, so we've got a question from earlier on from Zoe, who asks, is there an age when sequencing, i.e. writing numbers, letters the right way, not back to front, becomes a concern or indicator? For example, maybe not an issue for a 5-year-old who's recently started school, but if it continues into 6-year-old, is that a good indicator of a learning difficulty?
That's actually a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. What I say is that it's considered a developmental difficulty until the age of 8. We would expect children, once they reach the age of 8, to pass that. Now, however, if I've got a 5 or 6-year-old that is exhibiting other underpinning cognitive weaknesses, I worry about it much earlier. So if it's the only thing that they're doing, then let them grow out of it up to 8 or 9. but you will find that those students actually have other underpinning cognitive weaknesses, and if they have other ones, you don't want to leave it. And the reason I say you don't want to leave it is the research is now telling us that children develop their self-efficacy, their belief about themselves as learners, within 6 months of going to school. They've already decided whether they're a good learner or not. They've decided the pecking order of the class. Apparently, if we went into a class of 5.5-year-olds and said, can you put yourself into reading and maths groups, they can do so quite nicely without the help of an adult. So what we now say is our children need to be identified as early as possible. And I actually do full assessments, recommend them from the age of 6, is that as teachers, we often complain that children have learned helplessness and that have got learning difficulties, and also children who are third wave have poor strategies. The longer these children are left with undiagnosed and unsupported, they develop ingrained learned helplessness and poor strategies. And that means they're going to be harder to remediate and it's going to be more expensive. So we actually want to find out as early as possible. Thank you. So I think we may have covered all the questions at this stage. So I'm going to send out the recording. I'm actually going to send out all the notes that I've promised. They will probably be out to you tomorrow, probably by tomorrow afternoon. And don't hesitate to email me and we can have further discussion. It's been really great to have you all. Nice to see so many of you, and I look forward to working with you in the future.